a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. And we are here in the off season of into the 2022 season, and we were looking back, and one of the things I wanted to kind of bring up and we were talking about is who should have won the 2021 AL MVP?
Well, and we know who did.
We know who did, and that was Shohei Ohtani, but should have it been Vlad Guerrero Jr.? I mean, the offensive season he put up was pretty impressive. My answer is no, it's Ohtani.
And I was on the other side of the fence. I definitely argued strongly for Vlad Jr. to be that because he probably more than any player on that team was, the driving force that kept them in the race. And when they didn't make the playoffs and they didn't get the wild card, it kind of took the air out of my sails because the old joke with a guy like Shohei Ohtani is we could have finished fourth without you.
Yeah, they could have been the worst. They could have. Well, they weren't going to finish fourth because I think the Rangers had that pretty well in lock.
True.
But it wasn't like having Shohei Ohtani or not having a rather unbelievable season from Shohei Ohtani was the difference maker for the Los Angeles Angels.
Right. So it goes back to, most valuable. And so I get into trouble all the time because I argue because my thought of most valuable always has to do with the impact on team performance. And so if you take that tack, then you're going to be looking for teams that win. And as you and everybody else point out to me, is then, you're going to penalize a guy for being on a bad team.
Right. It's like it becomes almost a front office award because it basically goes to who's the best player on the team that's in first place. So whoever generally constructed the best roster is gonna win the MVP. And sure, there will be years where they get it right, and they do get it plenty of times because there is a guy on a team that isn't making the most. They're not having the highest payroll in baseball, but he still has an unbelievable year, and they finish in first. So it makes sense some of the time. But I think the idea that team value, it's such a hard thing to quantify, and is it really Shohei Ohtani's fault that Mike Trout was basically out the entire season last year?
Right.
Should he get punished for that?
So just looking at the award, I always remind myself that first real award, when I mean the today's MVP order by the writers as it ended up being started in 31, but they went back and had awards for players in the league before that. They had something that ended up, we called the MVP, it was called the Chalmers Award in 1911, honoring the most important and useful player to the club and the league. Okay, then they just continue that after.
Right, which makes sense because it's a lot of weird criteria.
So they do this for 3 years or 4 years, okay? And then 8 years later, in 1922, the American League and 2 years later, the National League, they gave an MVP to the baseball player who is of the greatest all-around service to his club. I mean, some of the stuff is just ridiculous when you think about that. And then prior winners were not eligible to win the MVP award again during this time, which makes no sense. It makes no sense. So we have the MVP. The first one was 1931. Jimmy Fox won the first MVP famously. And you vote on the MVP before the postseason. And this is something you should keep in mind when you think about it because...
And it was one of the things we were looking at. So one of the things we wanted to look at are the people that have won MVPs that are not in the Hall of Fame, because it was kind of an interesting thing to think about, like how often does it happen? And of the guys that did win an MVP and not make it a Hall of Fame, like what are kind of some of the interesting things about there? I think one of the interesting things is that there have been 61 MVP awards given to guys that did not make the Hall of Fame. Now, there are some people, Roger Maris, for instance, that did manage to pick up multiple MVPs in that time period without being in the Hall of Fame.
And Dale Murphy, as you mentioned before. Right.
So one of the interesting things, I think, is that there's 29 of the years where there was an MVP winner that's not in the Hall of Fame. They made the World Series. Not necessarily won it, but the guy that won the MVP ended up in the World Series. So about 50% of the time.
And that means that they played on good teams, bringing more notoriety to the player because you played in a winning team and people favor.
So generally what it is MVP is a pretty good indicator of team success. Right. More often than not, having the MVP on your team is a good thing.
And it changed so much over the years. Remember, we can go back and apply these things like WAR
and
to
we're going
seasons, right? To seasons that back then they didn't have that. They had home runs, RBIs, batting average, maybe walks or
and so you get
fielding
into
percentage.
you get into some screwy stuff. Like you look back at like when they were giving them out in that period where it was to greatest all around service to his club. Now, I don't know Roger Peckinpah. I don't know how much of a service he was to the New York Giants, but he put up 2.7 WAR in the year in 1925 when he won the MVP. So I can't imagine he was that much of a service to them.
And again, they retroactively apply WAR, but 2.7 is in fact the single lowest WAR year
And
for
it's
a
not
guy
even
who won
and
an
it's
MVP.
not close.
Right, and it's not close. There are guys in the threes, but nobody else.
Nobody else is in under 3. I don't think anybody else is under 3.5.
So and so when you go back to the beginning of them in the Atlantic, so Ty Cobb wins an MVP, and Tris Speaker wins an MVP in the first 2 years, and the second year. But two other guys won that you've never heard of: Frank Schulte and Larry Doyle won MVPs. They were the Chalmers Award. We've never heard of these guys. They both had WAR over 5. Retroactively go back, but they're not in the Hall of Fame. In fact, they're not really remembered.
We'll also say that technically there is one guy on this list that did make the Hall of Fame who won an MVP, but he's not in as a player, and that is Torrey. Torrey won the MVP in 71 playing third for the Cards, but he's in as a manager, not as a player. So he is counted as part of this list.
Right, and we had one of our listeners, reminded us, and I should really, the guy was nice enough to write to us. Dave Metter sent us an item saying that the Hall of Fame can, in fact, consider the entire career of a player, and we talk about that how he either goes in as a manager or he goes as a player. But as it goes, those whose careers entailed involvement in multiple categories will be considered for their overall contribution to the game of baseball. So to me, it's a bit of a mistake to put a guy in as a manager or a player because
that means you should just remove
more than that.
Well, that means what you should do is remove the problem is you can't remove the distinction, because even as a fan, I'm like, okay, you can bridge the gap and consider playing time and managing time as one and the same, that you're getting in on sort of the merits of both. But then the problem is if you take away all distinction and you're in the Hall of Fame due to baseball contributions, owners should not be put in the same way.
No doubt about that.
As the players and managers, as executives.
And I think your point is right. I think you have to come down on one side or the other. So I believe Dusty Baker will be a Hall of Famer one day, right? He's going to win 2,000 games
as a manager.
As a manager. He had a nice playing career that helps him as a guy who's contributed so much to baseball.
About the fact that he was a player, but he is not a Hall of Fame player, and I'm pretty sure Dusty Baker would tell you that.
So there's another guy on the list that that has won multiple MVPs,
should be in the Hall of Fame,
and should not be in the Hall of Fame. On our list here, he won 2 MVPs not in consecutive years, and he played for the Texas Rangers.
Oh, I was thinking Dale Murphy.
Right. I think Dale Murphy should be in the Hall of Fame, but this
other guy,
nobody gives him any credit, and that's Juan Gonzalez. So he won MVPs in '96 with a 3.8 WAR, mind you, and in '98 with a 4.9 WAR. And by the way, in 1998, A-Rod, who didn't win the MVP, had a 9.7 WAR. Had a ridiculous. I think you pull up his season. Had a ridiculous season compared to Juan Gonzalez.
It's the kind of thing where you're looking at. I think A-Rod hit it was nutty looking at his statistics. He had an OPS, I think, of 1046 or something.
Right.
Just absolutely all phases while being a good defender, which Juan Gonzalez was not known as.
I just don't know. So at that time, I think we valued home runs so much.
Well, we can point to the
because Gonzalez hit home runs.
We could point to the better example of this, which also features A-Rod, interestingly enough, and that would be Mo Vaughn's MVP.
Right.
90.
Well, let's do the one that A-Rod didn't win.
Well, that was Albert Bell and Martinez.
Right. That was the one that A-Rod didn't win, and he was with Seattle, and he had a snappy season in 1998 where he played in 161 games. So A-Rod always played a lot. He batted .310, had 42 homers, 124 RBIs, and finished second to Juan Gonzalez, who had 3.9 WAR, and I think he hit 47 home runs or something like that. He had a few more home runs.
It was the home runs.
But I don't know and by the way, A-Rod hadn't yet started winning Gold Gloves. He ended up winning them after that. He hadn't won any all the way until 2003. Mm-hmm. And so why Juan Gonzalez is because of the love for the home run. But that's like A-Rod had 42 at shortstop. I mean, the guy was in left field.
But Juan had already won one. So...
Right. Oh, okay. So he had that
rep that existed, and that was still much. Part of the problem with a lot of the older MVP awards is that they were very much given away as part of a popularity contest.
No doubt. You heard me say that all the time.
The writers are the ones, especially before the advent of the internet, the writers were the ones voting on this, which means they were just talking about it. So that means if the writers really only had each other to go off of because they could only see these teams when they played each other. So if the writer in St. Louis loves a particular Cardinal and he's just saying, no, this guy needs to win one, and he's been saying that for the last 4 years, the guy has a good year one year, everybody might be like, fine, we'll give it to him just so he shuts up about this.
I think that they do got to come down on the fact of the reputation, because if this is to mess up,
It's
and if he
his
has a
year.
really good season, it's going to be hard to vote against him. So to speak.
It's a kind of like the Oscar situation where sometimes the guy that's winning this year is because he should have won for his season 5 years ago. They didn't give it to him at the time because they were too busy giving it to a guy that should have won 5 years before that.
Yeah. So, and your team, right? So in '84, the Tigers had a team that went out 35-5 for the season, right? And they won the World Series ultimately. But a relief pitcher won the MVP, which fairly unusual for a relief pitcher. I don't know any other relief pitcher actually that's ever won an MVP. And Willie Hernandez had a 4.8 WAR. And just nothing about that season was extraordinary, or the rest of his career. And there were plenty of other guys in 1984
Who had great years.
who were way more deserving.
But we were in a time where we were evaluating pitchers based off of how many wins they got. So if this guy got a bunch of wins.
No, he didn't have a bunch of wins. He went 9-3 with a 1.92 ERA. He pitched in 80 games, and he had 32 saves.
Yeah, I don't get it.
So he wins the MVP, where a guy named Eddie Murray, you've heard of Eddie Murray, yeah, right? Eddie Murray, Hall of Fame player, has a 7.1 WAR. He has 29 homers, 110 RBIs, 107 walks, 410 on base, 918 ops. Yeah, he finished fourth.
Right, but
Another relief pitcher finished third.
that's because we didn't know how to evaluate players outside of just, like in Moneyball when they're talking about all like the scouts and the way they look at guys, they're like, oh, he's got an ugly girlfriend, he's probably not that good. Like, we still look at players like that, and we remember players being better than they are if we like them. We hang on to the idea that this guy still got it even when he doesn't. So when it comes to these MVP things, perception, public perception, writer perception, and the mythological status of the player matters so much, at least in the past. Now, you almost never see it. If you look at MVP winners since like 2000, every guy has a really solid WAR. There's only like one that kind of sticks out as being weird, which is Justin Morneau's 2006 AL MVP. But if you look at who he's going against that year, there's not a ton of other people. Minnesota was, I think, the best team in the league that year. Really, the guy you look at.
No, they made the playoffs. They didn't.
They didn't have the best record. I thought they had the best record that year.
Maybe they did. That's right. They played the Cardinals in the World Series, right?
No, they didn't, because they lost. Because they
06?
lost to the. They would have lost to the. They lost to the Yankees like every year in the playoffs.
Yes, they didn't get to the World Series. You're right.
Right. 06 would have been Tigers.
The Cardinals beat the Tigers.
Cardinals beat the Tigers because that was the series where the Tigers had that unbelievable brain fart at third base, if I remember correctly. But Morneau that year, like, he was good, but Ortiz, like, Morneau hit like 30 something homers. Ortiz hit like 54, which you could say, oh, look, the voters evolved. But the problem is that Morneau put up like 4.3
WAR. Yeah.
Everybody else was over 5. So he was just the best offensive player on the best team.
But even then, we weren't using. And again, it's not that using BWAR is the only way to evaluate it, but it's very interesting to see, because it helps you look at the season and go, here's what we think is important now. In fact, when Morneau won that, he was the second of 3 consecutive first basemen. Pujols in the National League won in 05, Morneau won in 06, and Ryan Howard won in 06 as well. The only time that he exceeded 5 WAR in his entire career. And you were saying that winning an MVP at first base is harder than ever now.
Right, and you're going to still see guys do it, but I think part of the reason why you're going to see it's being harder and harder for guys to rack up MVPs at first base is you're not going to be able to rack up DWAR like guys at other positions.
If you're going to use WAR.
If you're going to use WAR as one of your metrics, you're going to look at it, and the ability for a first baseman to impact the game defensively is not the same as a guy that's playing center or short. And I think also it's harder to stand out relative to your peers at first base than it is at positions where you don't typically expect a lot of power. For if you have a shortstop that's hitting 335 home runs, it's a lot more valuable than a first baseman.
No doubt about that.
So you weight it towards certain positions, like the same way. Like I can look at last year. If DeGrom had stayed healthy and kept pitching like he had the first half of the season, he probably would. And the Mets made the playoffs. He wins MVP and Cy Young going away. It's not even close.
So, and I'm glad you mentioned that the winning aspect is pretty good for the MVP. It's an important part of it. So if DeGrom kept pitching the way they were and the Mets didn't make the playoffs, does he still get an MVP?
He's probably up there, but it's a lot closer of a race. And, people would say, well, does that mean it's just going to go to Ohtani every year? And from now on,
I'd be one of those people.
And I don't think so, because one, the guy pitched like a top 5 he played like a top 5 hitter for sure, and a top 10 to maybe even a top 5 pitcher in the AL. If you have a guy on your team doing that every year,
he should be MVP every year. He
probably should be MVP every year, because just purely from a value standpoint, if you're equating value to dollars, whatever you're paying Shohei Ohtani is not as much as you'd be paying one guy to do both of those things.
And that's a nice thing. I think it's sort of a byproduct. But your point of that if he continues at this level is what it is, right?
It gets way more
just because he pitches and hits, and if he's a pretty good hitter and a pretty good pitcher, that doesn't make him MVP because he does both.
Yeah, it's a lot more interesting of a discussion if Shohei's a top 5 hitter and like a top 30 pitcher.
Right. So he has to maintain
superior
level of excellence.
Because if he's top 5 in both, there's really no way you can't give it to him. But if the pitching or the hitting starts sliding and he starts becoming one more than the other, well, then you're saying, well, yeah, he was a good hitter this year, but he was not Vlad Guerrero Jr. good.
So what is interesting is I kind of cut off our list at 2011 because a lot of the guys that are on the list are still playing, active, so it didn't really make sense. But you mentioned first baseman and DHs. I think you have to sort of consider the DH in there as well if you're not Shohei Ohtani, of course,
right?
And you actually don't play the field. So since 2015, you've got Giancarlo Stanton won an MVP. I guess he played some outfield in the year in Florida that he was.
But he had a pretty unbelievable year that year.
Right, and then Jose Abreu plays first base and DHs for them.
You're still going to have guys that'll get MVPs out of those positions, because who are your biggest mashers and offensive threats a lot of the time? First baseman and DHs. So guys that have an unbelievable year like that will always be in the running for an MVP. But I think you have to have you're not going to get the cheapy MVP as you used to. You're not going to pull a Don Baylor in 79 and get an MVP.
Right. And you have to be careful. You look at 2020 because they only played 60 games, and so that the total WAR is going to be half or less than half of what it normally would be.
Generally, when people look at 2020, I think for the most part, people are going to throw away awards from that season.
So some anomalies, right? There was a guy in 1950 named Jim Constanti, and he played for the Philadelphia Phillies. And those, because I remember that, the whiz kids of 1950 who lost the World Series to the Yankees, but that was the Phillies, who, by the way, who had never won a World Series and didn't win one until finally in 1980. They made the World Series that year, so he played on a World Series team, and he had a 4.4 WAR, so there's the under 5 number. But the thing that really struck me was he had a career 11 WAR. So he had like 40% of his WAR in one season, and he somehow won the MVP and never did anything else the rest of his career noteworthy.
I mean, there's only one other guy that really matches that, which was the guy that won for Texas in the 70s.
Oh, Jeff Burroughs.
Right, because he had like, I think like a 3.6 WAR that year, and he was like under 20 for his career.
Yeah, he was a catcher. I think he hit 36 home runs that year, and so catchers that hit lots of home runs, and so everybody like, well, they've got nobody else to pick. I guess we'll pick this guy. That's kind of how it happened. And again, he had a 17 WAR for his whole career. Steve Garvey won an MVP in the National League with a 4.4 WAR. Never was a giant Steve Garvey fan. Just would always be the kind of guy that struck me that he'd go 5 for 5 in a 17-3 Dodger route.
Right, it's like empty stats, as people will call it.
Just felt like that. I don't think it's fair, but that's how it felt like.
We're starting to evaluate that now. We're starting to look at the home runs that guys hit, because what's better, a guy that hits 20 high leverage home runs or a guy that hits 30 home runs, but only 10 of them are in situations that actually matter?
Right. The guy
hit 20 big ones.
We want the guy who hits the big home runs.
Right, exactly. So I think you're going to see things like that are meaningful, being the type of player that is clutch is not quantifiable, but it is.
I wonder if, like, when those guys won MVPs, the Juan Gonzalez's, and I remember when Mo Vaughn, he's a local guy from Norwalk here, a local hero, won the MVP for the Red Sox. And both Albert Bell and Edgar Martinez that year finished with 7 WARs. And Mo Vaughn won the MVP with a 4.3 WAR. And so you think, at the time, did I think, well, gee, Mo Vaughn wasn't really deserving? I think I probably had thought at the time, because Mo Vaughn played first base. Edgar Martinez was a DH. So I probably, in my mind, thought, okay, I'm going to ding Edgar Martinez because he didn't play the field.
And Albert Bell probably was
and when he did play the field, you didn't want him to.
Yeah, and Albert Bell was as bad a defender as Mo Vaughn. So
you would excuse it away, and you didn't have the metric of WAR to go, you know what? Despite the fact that Albert Bell's such a bad defender, he still has 7 WAR.
And so what you would do is you would just look at the numbers and you would go, okay, well, Mo Vaughn's got probably a similar, if comparable, average to Albert Bell. He's hit more home runs, he's got a few more RBIs, and he plays for a team that doesn't have as much talent around him. So he's the only one in that lineup. Yeah, Mo Vaughn should get it. But when you really look at the numbers, they're like, oh, he should not get it.
And so, to wit, aside from the 2020 season, there hasn't been somebody who's had a less than 5 WAR season since when Morneau was the one guy
Morneau
is
in he's the only one guy in the 2000s.
So, and I think now that we know what it is, it's going to be really hard for people to, didn't see the guy had a 4.1 WAR.
The only way you're ever going to have that happen is if some pitcher has one of those weird statistical seasons where, like, in theory, they shouldn't be good, but they are.
Right.
Like, because they have a really weird batting average on balls in play. Like, everything guys are just ripping the cover off the ball and just going at people the entire season. And so you've got some guy that finishes, 21-6 with, a 2.9 ERA, and everybody's like, he's not actually that good, but the numbers make him look that good.
And look, we're cherry picking here, right? So we're going for the seasons. Let's find the worst seasons of the guys who won the MVP, which it's kind of interesting to talk about, particularly during a work stoppage in Major League Baseball. So when you look at stuff, Hall of Famers though kind of come out, and I'm going to say, because he isn't. Neither of these guys are Hall of Famers yet. Alex Rodriguez won the first of his 3 MVPs in 2003. The other MVPs, he had an 8.4 WAR, were over 9. Albert Pujols also had an 8.4. The next year, won 3 MVPs, also all more than 9. When you have 9 WAR in a season,
you don't do that by accident.
Right. You're probably a guy like I don't know too many guys. We should do another one. Okay, who had the highest WAR season, to single season where he just outperformed? We kind of did that a little bit.
No, but we would want to look at it more like who were the players that a single season was the greatest percentage of their overall WAR.
Right. And we saw Constanti had 44%.
Right. And so you'd have to put some cutoff, because there's probably a couple guys that they put up 2 WAR in their career and they did it 1.8 in one season. But you put a level on that. It would be interesting to see who are the guys that kind of they were a really one season wonders.
So we do have, Hall of Famers. Frankie Frisch, Hall of Famer, the guy traded for Rogers Hornsby, the Fordham Flash. He won that first MVP with Jimmy Fox in 1931 for the National League with a 4.0 WAR. Mickey Cochran won in 34 with the Tigers with a 4.5 WAR. Gabby Hartnett, famous for his homer in the Gloman, in 1935 had a 4.9 WAR. Ernie Lombardi, the slowest player ever to play Major League Baseball, won the MVP in 38 with a 4.8 WAR. And Joe DiMaggio won the 1947 AL MVP with a 4.7 WAR. That just struck me really interesting.
But I mean,
Joe DiMaggio.
I mean, what was our original number when we were talking about WAR for the Hall of Fame? You needed to average 4 WAR a year in order to be Hall of Fame eligible.
For us, it was 3 that allowed you to talk about them.
You were allowed to talk about it. 4 generally.
4 is going to be guys that are going to probably be in the Hall of Fame. So
it's not surprising that you could, because the other thing that you have to think about with WAR is the relative rest of the field. So a guy could win a season where he only had 4.9 WAR, but if nobody else was even close to that because everybody sucked that year, then you're going to win with less than 5.
So, I just, the other anomaly I went back and thought is, you have the guys that had the big WAR. We know Barry Bonds and Babe Ruth had a big WAR and all that kind of stuff. The biggest WAR season, however, I could find of the MVPs belongs to not Babe Ruth, who had a 14.2 in 1923. That's
pretty good.
That's a pretty amazing season. And Barry Bonds had an 11.9. So, no, it's Walter Big Train Johnson. Had the best WAR season ever in 1913. He had a 16.5 WAR for the season as a pitcher.
like pitchers back then were not particularly good.
No, he hit then. So one of the things I went and checked is because guys hit, and he was a pretty good hitter, is that I think he got, like 4 or 5 WAR on his hitting or something, enough WAR that it was significant to his total.
20 to 25% of his total WAR.
But that, wins above replacement. So you think about the time he was pitching, that's how much better he was than everybody else to have a 16.5 WAR in one season. That's the highest season.
Nobody will ever beat that.
I don't think so
ever.
Either. So I think we're interesting to see if Ohtani will continue to do that, and if he'll put up. He had a 9.1 WAR this year. So you know what? That's a big season. 9 WAR is right. Hall of Fame like.
I think it's the same way where you're like, you can't make it purely about what guy is the most valuable player to his team, because to kind of use the NBA defense, do you really want to give the MVP to LeBron every single season? Because it would go to him if you're just talking about purely the player that brings the most quote unquote value to the court. Because you even get into that. It depends on what the person assigning the award deigns as
But
value.
I can argue that. It basically, he's the guy that goes on your team and you play for a championship every year, and when he's not there, you're terrible. We've seen guys like leave the team and all of a sudden they're terrible. That has to be the most valuable player, because without him, they're terrible, and with him, they're a championship caliber team. So
baseball, at least it's harder for one player to make that level of difference. But
correct. So finally, in the last 10 years, the 2 highest WAR seasons for MVP winners go to Mike Trout, unsurprisingly, with a 10.5, and Mookie Betts.
Betts is a kind of player that people are going to be surprised that he has already started to accumulate Hall of Fame worthy statistics.
Right. We've put him on that track. Like, hey, he's got a long way to go.
You don't realize how good
he's already got the requisite 10 years. He just doesn't have the aggregate stats that are going to make people go, whoa.
Oh, okay, yeah. But when you look at the numbers and the projections, he should get there.
So I would think all the writers now, though, are considering WAR when they think about MVP, whereas before they didn't even know.
Before it was eye test and who hit the most home runs. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.